Hello, and welcome to Chapter 3 of Maintaining Creativity 6, being held on this Monday, the first day of November. How did that happen? My name is Scott Walker. I'm the Executive Director of CSARN, and like many of you, I am also a senior professional artist. We would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge that we live, work, meet, and travel on the traditional territories of Indigenous peoples who have cared for this land, now called Canada, since time immemorial. We would also like to acknowledge this as part of our covenant with First Nations to share, respect, and protect the land in the spirit of peace and friendship, and to honor the future generations of all of our nations. This is truly an international gathering today. We have artists from across the country, from Happy Valley Goose Bay in the east to Yellowknife in the north to Vancouver Island in the west, and many joining us from outside the Canadian borders, from as far away as Dallas, Texas, from Florida, from New Jersey, and Durban, South Africa. And a warm welcome to you all. For anybody who's new to our organization, CSARN stands for Canadian Senior Artists Resource Network, and we use the term senior to describe artists who, either by age or years of experience, consider themselves seniors in their field. Today's topic is ageism and the other isms in the arts, as opposed to aging, which is not something we can do an awful lot about. I mean, we often make fun of it ourselves, like, when I was growing up, I wanted to be older. This is not what I expected. Or it's weird being the same age as all those old folks. You know what I mean. Ageism, however, completely different topic. It's in all aspects of society. Some call it the last acceptable form of prejudice. But we feel it possibly more than most people because we as artists are still working. The vast majority of us are still working and often facing ageism. And then there are the other isms, some of which don't even end with ism. We'll be talking about those too. Here's how Chapter 3 is going to unfold. We will I will introduce each of our guest stars who will make an opening statement, and then we will have a discussion on today's topic. We invite you to join in the discussion by putting your questions in the Q&A box. At the end of our discussion, in about an hour from now, we'll take a 10-minute break, and then we will begin the breakout sessions. They're like our online salons, our own salons. It's a chance to chat with other artists, perhaps from around the world. Each breakout will have a moderator to guide the discussion. The breakouts will take about 40 minutes, and then we'll all gather back here to find out what each group talked about. Now, I encourage you to stay with us because at the end of today's show, we will be announcing the winner of the 3rd annual Visionary Artist Lifetime Award. So let's begin. I'm going to introduce each of our 4 distinguished artists, beginning with our first, who is a video artist and writer, Professor Emeritus at the Faculty of Arts at OCAD University, an award-winning videographer whose work encompasses a range of topics: race, sexuality, racism, colonialism, and more. Please welcome Richard Fung.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. I'm in Toronto, and I'm on the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Mississaugas of the Credit, who are the original owners and custodians of the land. I want to start by putting forward 2 concepts that I find useful and productive in the discussion of the topic today. The first is systemic discrimination. The second is intersectionality, both of which have become red flags to the right wing in North America. Systemic discrimination, the first thing I'd say is that it's not systematic discrimination, which suggests something deliberate and methodical. In fact, systemic discrimination doesn't require any feelings of apathy at all. It's the result of normal everyday ways of doing things. So for example, people with mobility issues, including older people, suffer when buildings are designed with lots of steps and you can't get down to a washroom, for example, or it's too small to accommodate a wheelchair. I was a member of the first Racial Equality Committee of the Canada Council in the 1980s, which was convened by the then director Joyce Siemens and was run by Chris Creighton Kelly. It was also parallel to an indigenous process that featured artists like Alanisa Bomsawin and Margot Kane, who sat on both committees, actually. Staff of the council were all very nice, but when we looked at the composition, and this is the late 80s, at the cusp of the 90s, pretty much the only racialized people who worked at the council were the cleaners, right? And very few racialized or indigenous artists were getting grants at the council at that point. And in that process, I reflected on my own experience of getting my first grant with the council. And I remember that when I was applying, my friend John Grayson had said, don't follow the form, don't follow the instructions that you're given. Here is a grant application that I got. And what I did was I actually followed that. I ignored the form and I got my first grant. When I sat on juries myself, I realized that the people who did follow the form didn't actually get grants because they didn't give enough or the right kind of information, right? And so that's something that in the system, it was not willed, right? And had I not been taken under the wing of people like John Grayson or Colin Campbell in my early career, I would have had no way of knowing that. And for most racialized and indigenous artists, I realized they were not in such circuits of knowledge. During that process, I also came across another fact, if we were looking at the history of the council, and that is that women really got grants from the council until the 70s, in which they decided to invite women specifically to sit on juries. And what happened then is that women brought different sensibilities, different perspectives, different kinds of consideration to considering work. And I think they also spread the knowledge of how the juries worked, what was expected among their constituency, among other women artists. And then finally, women seeing that women finally were getting grants, were encouraged to apply. So that's one of the ways in which a system can change. Now, I've used the term women here, but of course, in that era, it was mostly white women who were getting grants. And this is where intersectionality comes in. Intersectionality is a term that was developed by African-American legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989. And basically what it says is that one needs to consider race, gender, ethnicity, sexuality, class, disability, nationality, body type, geographic location, religion, language, etc., not as separate and discrete, but in the ways that they intersect. And I'll try and give you my little opening. One short example, and hope that I can get back to this later when we have a more fulsome discussion. The impact of intersectional setbacks, systemic intersectional setbacks, it works very differently, I think, within each of the art forms that I can think of. And it's most obvious in acting. It's clear that it's not a secret that older male actors have many more roles, have much easier longevity in their career, especially in relation, you can see that in relation to older women and the roles that they're offered. And so the roles of older indigenous and racialized, for racialized and indigenous actors is far and few between. You see them very rarely in leading positions in films or on TV. Not only are there fewer parts, but when younger, many of these actors weren't given the roles that allowed them to either showcase their talents or to give them the experience to take on bigger roles. When I was casting for the one video of mine that involved drama in the 1990s, I was really struck that the Asian actors who came to audition, when I looked at their CVs, the women had all played geisha and sex workers, and the men all had been triad members. And I remember a workshop with the theater actor Brenda Camino way back in the 90s also, where she said she would scream if she got another part that required her to wear a lab coat. And that's because to have an Asian actor in a lab coat or play a doctor was a positive, but still a peripheral role, right? But it would give the impression of a multi-ethnic world and a kind of a, so you can have you can suggest that the world is very mixed, but in fact, all the protagonists are white. This is clear when you look at something like Pose or the new CDC series, Sort of, which shows that there's been a huge bank of non-white trans actors who have not got hired. What's happened is is that hopefully in years to come, you will see these people taking on older roles. And the other thing I would say, it's systemically what it's also required is that that's produced by Sienna, which has also been doing a lot of work with non-white talent. And it features someone like, Bilal Beg writing. My friend Ian Rashid is also a writer on the series. So I'm saying there's no quick fix, there's no easy fix, and it requires a whole systemic change in order to make this, to make the intersectional changes that we need. Thank you.
Richard Fung, thank you very much. We'll get back to you in just a couple of minutes. I'd like to introduce our next guest, who is a journalist who's read Weekly and enjoyed Weekly in the Globe and Mail. Her latest book is about contemporary feminism. It is called Shrewd, a wry and closely observed look at the lives of women and girls. She's last year's winner of the Landsberg Award for her reporting on gender equality. Please welcome Elizabeth Renzetti.
Hello, thank you so much, Scott, for that welcome. And I'm so happy to be here today. So fascinating to listen to what Richard had to say. And I'm also really interested in talking about these isms from an intersectional perspective. I think my contribution here will be as both an author and a journalist. So to be able to give perspective from my own creative life, but also in what I've learned over many decades, 3 decades now, as a journalist. I was the arts editor of the Globe and Mail's, at the Globe and Mail for a few years. I was also the books editor for a number of years, and I was the publishing reporter as well. So I think publishing is kind of the area I know best, and we'll be able to speak to the isms there. But I'm also an avid consumer of all other arts, and so would love to talk about these many things. I am also a person who just last week got her first seniors discount at Shoppers. Yes, very happy to say I got that 10% or whatever it was. So as a journalist, I think it'll be interesting to talk about what it means to be a senior artist represented in the media as the media shrinks, as the number of outlets gets smaller in some ways, legacy outlets anyway, but also increases in other ways. So we see, for example, an increase in online outlets and things, which are, so in that way, there is a broader and kind of more expansive realm for art coverage, criticism, and things like that. But in the legacy media, we see that shrinking. So what does that mean for artists, especially senior artists? And I think there continues to be, to this day, I wouldn't say an obsession, but maybe a fixation on the new, the young, the up and coming, 30 under 30, 40 under 40, these really niche little categories that pigeonhole people, pigeonhole artists, but are convenient, for journalists and also for people in cultural industries as a way of promoting new young talent. But do we focus too much on that? I was also interested to hear what Richard said about, casting for his videos. I remember I've interviewed so many authors over the year, and I remember interviewing the actress and author Carmen Aguirre a few years ago for her book, which was actually called Mexican Hooker #1, because those were the roles that she, as a Latina woman, as a person who had been part of the sort of political diaspora from Chile, those were the roles that she was being offered, things like hotel cleaner and sex worker and things like that. So it'll be very interesting to discuss some of those issues. I wanted just very quickly to say too that I, in my writing, have always been interested and tried to focus on, I've just been drawn to senior writers, older writers, especially women, and 2 in particular were really personal inspirations for me, and I can talk a little bit more about them later. but one was, they're both British. One was Diana Athill, who was a very famous editor of people like Jean Rhys and Margaret Atwood, V.S. Naipaul, and she became a very celebrated memoirist later in her life, and in her 80s wrote a book called Somewhere Towards the End, which was celebrated and award-winning. And I went to interview her, and she was so incredibly inspirational that I was in my 40s at the time, and I had kind of thought, oh, you know, it's passed me by, this writing thing. I'll always be a journalist. I'll never write a book. And she completely inspired me to pick up the pen again on a novel I'd started, and which I published at the age of 47, my first novel. My second book was published at the age of 51. And the other person who really inspired me was Phyllis James, P.D. James, as she was known popularly, who I interviewed several times over the years, again, beginning when she was in her 80s, and she had written her 19th mystery novel at that time. And she taught me such a lesson about courage, because her last book, which was called Death Comes to Pemberley, was a book she had been sort of putting off her whole life because she was obsessed with Jane Austen and thought she could never kind of transgress on that sacred territory, could never write about Jane Austen or take the characters. And only it was her last book, so only in her late 80s did she finally decide, you know, what do I have to lose? I'm going to write about this person who is the most important writer to me. And she took Jane Austen's character, she took Elizabeth Bennet and Mr. Darcy from Pride and Prejudice, and wrote a mystery novel around them. And again, that also, that bravery really, I found extremely inspirational. So I hope we can talk today about some of those things, some of the inspirational stories, but also obviously some of the limitations that we have as senior artists and our responsibilities as media people.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and congratulations on the shopper's discount.
Thank you.
Welcome to the club.
Thanks.
Elizabeth Renzetti. We'll be back in just a couple of minutes. Let me introduce our third star, though, a poet, playwright, and essayist who is the executive director of CIPAMO, the Cultural Pluralism in the Arts Movement Ontario. He is the artistic director of the Winds in the Leaves collective that creates works involving diverse artistic disciplines. Hello, Charles C. Smith.
Hi, good afternoon, Scott, and our other panelists, Richard, Elizabeth, Mary. Glad to be involved in this session with you. I think Richard and Elizabeth have led off really well, so I just want to quickly reference their concerns about some age-old isms, but the impact of intersectionality, which I think is rather important. My work these days, you know, I can span back to the 80s up to the current day, being active in the arts. And I'm quite concerned about these isms in the arts because, you know, frankly, I'm not seeing them disappearing as quickly as we would like. And I say that with a lot of experience, both as a writer, as an organizer, as the head of an arts organization that looks at these issues on a regular basis. About 2 weeks ago, I received an email from a colleague of mine who was active in Black Theatre Canada in the 1980s. And my organization, Cultural Pluralism, we put on festivals twice a year. And so we have one coming up in December. And this colleague, friend, wrote me and said, wouldn't it be wonderful to have a panel at your session that brings together the Black matriarchs who are really at the basis of Black theater in Canada? And I thought, wow, I know these people. I've worked with them. Vera Cudjoe, Amar Harris, Audrey Zena Mandiela, and a few others, Janet Sears, and so on, who are likely now in their senior years, as I am. And the question I had to ask myself is, what do I remember about being involved with Black Theatre Canada back in the 1980s, and where are we now? I'm still active as an artist. I'm still active as a performer. I have a performing group that I bring together for various work. And I think the challenges might be a little less difficult than they were then, but they are still extraordinarily difficult. And I say that because every arts council this day talks about equity. They talk about priority groups. Seniors are not included in that priority groups, but another age group is youth. And they talk about the need to achieve equality of outcomes. But I don't see any path toward that. I don't see any shift in significant shift in funding to make sure that this happens. And recently, my organization has been in correspondence with Canada Council on this very issue, asking them, when are you going to have a plan that truly achieves equality? We have to remember that when these councils were established based upon the work of the Massey Commission, at that time, Indigenous arts activity were outlawed, and that arts activities of other racialized groups were considered to be multicultural or folk, not high art, not serious. At the same time, shortly after, the councils were established, Canada Council, SSHRC, CBC, et cetera, CRTC, and so on. And then the provincial arts councils come into play, all basically with the same value systems, a Eurocentric approach that negated the value of other art forms as being art, and so on and so forth. So the question we have now is, all right, you say there's equity. I mean, to go back to, what was it, the movie that, I'm forgetting his name, Jerry Maguire, Show Me the Money. You know, I mean, this is really serious. Show us the path by when organizations and artists who have been blocked for some 40 to 50 years, while other arts organizations and other artists were able to build up their base, build up their funding, build up their political support and representation, build up their audience, build up their membership, build up their donations, while others were locked out of the system. And so many of these artists, as I said, including myself, and Richard's already self-declared, as has Elizabeth, are now in our senior years. And I have to admit, back in the 80s, it was difficult getting grants. Today, it is difficult getting grants, even when one self-identifies as being a person of color. What does that mean? I happen to be a Black person of color, not an Asian person of color. You know, these are very different questions we're asking ourselves, not just on intersectionality, but disaggregating racialized data so we can recognize the fullness of our experiences here. We do not all come the same way. Our experiences are not all the same. And at the same time, we're faced in a situation now in Canada where our immigration levels are rather high, 350 to 400,000 every year. And many artists coming from different parts of the world are settling here who do not have a sense of the granting system, who may not speak English or French as a first language, and yet have to face grant forms that require a rather significant knowledge of English sentence structure. Yet these are phenomenal artists, and this will continue. This will continue. And the question that I bring to today's conversation in regard to questions of ageism, intersectionality, and issues of race is that, you know, as a senior artist, I still can apply for grants. As a senior artist, I do get grants here and there. But I guess the question for me is, where are the intersections between senior artists who have faced difficulties for, let's say, 40 years or 50 years? Senior artists who have ducked out of the system because the systems just were not willing to provide support. How do we connect with them? How do we raise the issues that they've had and they continue to have in this day and age? Those are the questions that I really think are important. We know in Canadian society that ageism is one of these dirty words, and you know, it does happen. I know people, especially with women, I hear from many women that when they hit the 50s, it's kind of like they have to start watching the clock as to when they might be out the door for someone who's much younger. Men don't have the same challenge. However, that is an issue. We know across the country right now, the issues of Indigenous concerns are quite frightening when we look at residential, I don't want to call them schools, but what we've learned about residential areas and the graveyards that are there, and the continued difficulties of making truth and reconciliation happen. The national holiday, as we know, for truth and reconciliation, the head of our country took vacation. Talks about the significance of the issue. So those are issues. We know about the impact of Black Lives Matter for example, and many organizations that joined the Black Pledge shortly after George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and Regine in Toronto were killed by law enforcement. A year later, we find that about 80% of those organizations have done nothing. It was the moment to say something, but not to do anything. A colleague of mine who runs Cahoots Theater, Tanisha Tate, Black woman, when she saw all the theater organizations putting up statements in solidarity with Black Lives Matter, her question was, that's great, but I don't see Black people on your stage. I don't see Black people in your administration. I do see them, as Richard pointed out earlier, cleaning your halls. So we really have to ask ourselves, is the change happening quick enough? Martin Luther King wrote some 60 years ago in his book, Why We Can't Wait, is that not only is it immoral to continue in this way, but it also does damage to the nation's fabric through the rise of anger, through the loss of resources, through the continued discrimination against those who have been unfairly locked out of these systems since they began in this country in the 1950s. So that's what I wanted to add to the conversation today, and we'll see how it goes.
Charles C. Smith, thank you very much, Charles. We'll be back in a moment or two. The fourth guest today needs no introduction, so I'm not going to bother. No, I'm just kidding. She is the creator and star of This Hour Has 22 Minutes. Her characters include the bane of politicians everywhere, Marg Delahunty. Countless TV and film appearances. Her debut novel, Crying for the Moon, was a Canadian bestseller. She lends her name and voice to many causes, including the CNIB and CAMH. Welcome, a CSARN artistic advisor, Mary Walsh.
Hi. I was going to speak about ageism. I was going to say, you know, old age, it has a really bad reputation, better than death, but not by much. And that when I had that happy day and got my first old age pension check, which I thought, wow, what a great country. I used to be able to get an opportunity for youth grant when I was young, and now I'm getting some money because I'm old. You know, now, of course, the roles that I'm offered, I write roles for myself, but the roles that I'm offered are always consistently old woman dying of cancer. So I'm really good at that. But when I was listening to people talk, I thought about my son, who is Inuit. And I thought about a book that Jesse and I read by a gentleman who was a prosecutor or worked with the Crown in Saskatchewan, and then and is Indigenous. His name is Mr. Johnson, and he then started to do defense work, and then he realized that he was getting nowhere, that things were not changing, that there is a glad do law in place that says when an Indigenous person in this country comes up before a judge, they must take into consideration the 60s scoop, residential schools, all the total, the land that was stolen from them. That has to be taken into, he said he's done all this research, and in fact, the Glad-Do law has made things worse. There have been a number of systemic changes, and he says it's not the system, it's us. It's us. You know, you see yourself come up through the system as a woman, you know, and a white woman with lots of privilege, and I admit that. But you see other fellas come up, you know, not seemingly anymore, but everybody's so happy to push the prince forward, to help the prince get up, to make sure that everything goes to them. And so it's been, you know, particularly in comedy, it's been difficult to be a woman in comedy because, you know, like Margaret Atwood said, men are afraid of women because they're afraid they're going to laugh at them, and women are afraid of men because they're afraid they're going to kill them. But, you know, it's not nobody in those 10 things you want first in a woman. No man has ever written funny, but women are always writing with a sense of humor. When I was young, you know, 15, in that awful age when you're just so uncomfortable and unhappy, and people would always say to me, enjoy yourself now, Mary, because this is the best time of your whole life. And I used to think, Lord, lamplighting Christ, if this is the best time of my life, I'm just going to go hang myself. But for me, and I realize that I live in a country with great privilege and that I have great privilege, but for me, this has been the best time of my life. I find that not work-wise, not career-wise, but myself-wise, and I'm the person, of course, who I'm with 24/7, and I just feel so much better. And I don't know if everybody, like I was talking to these women, I was on Fogo Island, and I was talking to these older women, and they were going the golden age. Oh yeah. And they're having a great time, but the word is out there that old age is the worst age, whereas there is scientific proof now that the older you get, the happier you get, and that is across all races, all economic systems, all health, even health matters. So I think that rang true for me. So sometimes I feel like I just need to get the word out there that it isn't as dire and as grim and as horrible. There are many, 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 many horrible things in the world, that's for sure. But getting older, getting the privilege of actually getting older and actually knowing yourself a little bit better and actually getting used to being alive and knowing what you can do and what you can't do, as opposed to constantly running yourself up against brick walls, which, was what I thought was fun when I was younger, is a great privilege and adds to the other privileges that I've had in my life. But that was an alarming book that Mr. Johnson wrote about the way the system changes, and yet judges will use the Glad-Do law. When the Glad-Do law is mentioned in court, the judge will give a longer sentence. That's what he found. I'm not sure if I told that part of the story, that the laws that are in place have actually made the judges act against what they're supposed to do, which is to take into consideration all these things, all the realities of Indigenous life in this country. But what they do is they get angry that there's somebody telling them what to do, and they actually give a longer sentence. And so that was so, and his point was that it isn't systemic, it is us. I don't know. I don't know what anybody else thinks of that. And that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. Don't go away. Please stay with us, and I'll invite our other panelists to rejoin us as well. By the way, Mary, our first chapter one, our keynote speaker was Dr. Daniel Levitin, and in his book, Successful Aging, he said that people are happiest at the age of 82.
Well, I'm already this happy. Think how fucking happy I'm going to be when I'm 82. God.
I was just going to say the best is yet to come.
Yes, yes.
Thank you, Mary, and thank you all of our panelists. Thank you for rejoining. Let's begin the discussion. Charles, you said, is the change happening quickly enough? And there are many changes that are happening and many that need to happen. The question is, as artists, how can we accelerate the rate of change? And Charles, you brought it up, so I'll start with you.
Sure. I think we have to be advocating. We have to really make it clear to the Minister of Heritage, to the Prime Minister, to the head of these various councils that, we can't wait anymore, and we shouldn't have to wait. And so I think because one of the things that I hear is that it's difficult for arts councils to change their approach because some organizations have very high-powered people sit on their boards and quickly call up a minister and say, don't do that. Right? Racialized communities, Indigenous communities don't have that. And until artists take the responsibility of saying, as Mary said, this is personal responsibility, that especially white artists begin to say, we have a responsibility to speak to the change that is needed, even if it means we get less to no money. Because we have groups of artists of great art that has just been blocked for systemic reasons, for personal reasons, for what the combination between them. So that's where we really need to be. I mean, I'm on the Canadian Arts Coalition, and that's what we do. We basically say now to the minister, to Canada Council, to the Prime Minister, the time for change is now. We need a path to end this discriminatory barriers and outcomes.
Charles, thank you. Elizabeth, I saw you nodding your head.
Yeah, I just, everything Charles has said has made me nod my head. And a couple different things. One is this idea that there was a kind of a great flashpoint last summer when all kinds of people from corporations to arts organizations made a lot of, and media organizations, very kind of, grand statements about how equality and diversity were going to be the watchwords going forward. And I'm not sure we've seen the change that we need to see from the ground up. I watched this panel last summer, Black actors who were at Stratford, and it was like a 2-hour-long panel, and it was just extraordinarily moving because they had all had different experiences, but the same experience in some ways of discrimination. So as what I would say is, as a journalist, it is on us a lot to be constantly aware of this, to be constantly aware of who we're covering, who we're quoting in stories, what we're writing about, who we include on panels, who we hire as editors, who those gatekeepers are. We just have so much more work to do.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Richard. You're muted, Richard.
As I said earlier, when I think of each of the different arts, it seems to me that that the way that they function is quite distinct. So I'm just going to switch now to talk a bit about the visual arts and the media arts, which is really sort of my home. And those are built on star systems, often small stars, not always big stars, but small stars as well. And there's a kind of a relationship between sort of getting grants, getting support, and being shown, right? Like if you have an exhibition, then that allows you to get a grant, and et cetera, right? They kind of go together. So that also the other factor is the way that curators and programmers work, which is that there's a pressure on them in terms of their own careers to kind of focus on the new. And as I had mentioned, I think earlier, perhaps in the thing that I wrote, is that there's been a lot of print about how the latest new artists in the international field are older women, right? So you have people who have either not been seen at all or had some kind of career like with bourgeois or people like that, who are also being there. All of a sudden that's turned to them. Right now, within the word in the visual arts community is that there's a big focus on Indigenous and Black artists. One of the things that scares me about all of these things, though, either it's older women or Indigenous or Black artists, is that when something becomes fashionable, there's a way that goes out of fashion, right? And that's the problem, that we need longevity, that we need a sort of sustainability for people. And within the visual arts, when I look at it, one of the things that I see is that it's a kind of Darwinian world, is that if you don't get the shows, it means you don't get the grants in mid-career, it means you're not around to be shown when you're older, right? And I've seen so many talented artists of all different kinds of subject positions and identities who just fall off because they're not getting support in the mid-career and they're not around to be here when when you're looking for older artists. I mean, those of us who have had university teaching careers or had managed to get administrative positions or other things, have been able to keep our head above water, as opposed to the few people who managed to maintain star careers throughout their lives. So that's something that is really striking me. In terms of the stuff that Charles said, when I go back to the 80s, and we made those systemic changes to the Canada Council in the early 90s, there was a huge shift. And then I was surprised to go back a few years later and to see how things had drifted back. So it's not something that you can make a change and it will stay. It has to be something that is fed, right, all along. And otherwise things will just drift back into the people who have the most power, the people who have the most access for whatever reasons, will then regain those because they systemically they are positioned for all those kinds of reasons, including questions of like who can fill out a grant application, as Charles, who has the kind of cultural capital to do that, will again reassert themselves.
Thank you, Richard. Mary.
Yes. I was going to say that, we're always saying, well, how can we change things? How can it ever be changed? What can we do? And when the current prime minister came in at first, he created a gender equal cabinet. And that went throughout government agencies like the CBC and like the National Film Board and like Telefilm, who always were totally against, we don't give out money to depending on whether you have tits or not. We give out money, meritocracy. It's a meritocracy. They were suddenly, as they always had been anyway, have to give it out regionally, they were suddenly having to come up against the whole idea that 51% of our population is female, and they were certainly not granting at that level. And now in the CBC, when they're doing shows, they have to hire 50% of the people who are hired as directors. Still in the acting business, it's we have to write more stuff for women, but this was a change, and it was a simple change that someone at the top went, I am going to do a gender equal, no wheels fell off the bus, nothing happened, no bad things happened. He had a gender equal cabinet. It radiated throughout the government agencies, and now there are more women directing, more women receiving grants as writers and directors within the confines of the Canadian government agencies. So that was a very simple thing that the man at the top did, which the man at the top could have done that 30 years ago. The man at the top could have done it 50 years ago. The man at the top could have done it 100 years ago, but he just did it, 10 years ago. And it did make a difference. It didn't fix everything, but it made a difference. Telefilm now grants differently. The CBC hires differently. The NFB hires differently. And so I guess what my answer to it would be that we would relentlessly, bother, in the same way that Richard just said, that those people have access to the government. They have access to the government because they have massive lobbying firms, and they can access and they can change laws, and so can we. I mean, we can do that, but we have to do it. And I think that gentleman, Mr. Johnson from Saskatchewan, was right, that it's not just systemic, it is us. And if we are not doing the work to pressure the people at the top to make the changes, then they're never going to be made, because why would they? They're there representing us, supposedly. If that's not what we want, if Alberta wants to, not have COVID, how much can we push things forward when a lot of the people don't seem to want that? So we have to organize, and we have to put pressure on the people who are making the laws, in the same way that the people who own Walmart, where we pay most of the salaries of their employees because they're living on food stamps, etc. The same way that they pressure government to go along with them, we have to do that. And I guess, you get busy, and you go and you have a family, and you have a job, or you don't have a job, one or the other. Both of them take up a lot of time, and you forget that you have an obligation to be the change also, as Gandhi said, to be the change that you want to see in the world, and to push. We sort of have to get up off our behinds, and but somehow or other, sometimes I find that I get a little righteous sometimes when I get going, and a little, full of myself, and a little ego driven, because look at me, I'm doing this, I'm doing that, And so somehow or other, we've got to appeal to people some of it is ignorance, I think. I mean, some of it is ill-willed, but some racism and sexism and misogyny is plain ignorance. People came out of a family situation, a community situation, you know, a television situation, for God's sake, if you watch television in the 60s and 70s, but where assumptions are made. And so there's got to be some, dare I say, gentle way to get us to do that, to make it worth everyone's while that everything changes, you know, that things change. And people don't want change to happen. I mean, even though it's the thing that happens most consistently in our lives, change is the only thing we can count on. We fight against it personally, community-wise. It's scary. And then, of course, it happens and you go, why was I ever against that? That was stupid. You know, and but it's frightening for people. Anyway, that's it from here.
I've heard a few words repeated. Advocacy is one of them. Intersectionality is the other. Is there a way we can put the two together to promote our ability to promote the isms that are good and remove the isms that aren't? Richard, you were the first one who mentioned intersectionality. I'll throw that to you.
Well, I think that one of the things that needs to get done is to change who the decision makers are. And so, for instance, one of the things, you know, the AGO, the Art Gallery of Ontario, which is a large gallery in my city, made the change attempt to confront what Indigenous art making had meant in relation to the kind of Eurocentric line of art history that had, you know, dominated the gallery years ago, with hiring Richard Hill, then Gerald McMaster, and now there's one in Nanabush. They have just hired recently Julie Crooks to be the first curator who's looking at African art and art of the African diaspora. And what this means, they now have their first big Caribbean show that's based on a Caribbean photo collection that they've acquired. So those kinds of things, I think, bringing decision makers into the institution is important to make those things sustainable and not just add-ons. That the whole system needs to be changed in terms of who the directors are, right? Who's running the place, who's running the place to be able to hire those curators, right? So I think that it's a long game. The entire change of the system that needs to happen.
Thank you, Richard. I'm going to throw the question next to Charles and add something which I think kind of is along the same lines. Susan Abbott in the Q&A box said that you mentioned identifying a path for change. Where would you want that path to lead? Which I think is kind of part of what we were just talking about.
Yes, I also want to add a term, systemics, intersectionality, and disaggregated data. And I add that, the federal government is beginning to look at this now, because as I said earlier, you know, they have this box. I remember once speaking to Bob Sermon, former head of Canada Council, where he said to me about the self-identification form, what did I think of it? And the self-identification form, very similar to the employment equity self-identification form, has women, right? All women are the same. All persons with disabilities are the same. All Aboriginal people are the same. And then there's visible minorities. And in the visible minority box, it had Asian, South Asian, Latin American, West Asian, Arab, Black, Caribbean, African. And I just said to him, if I check that box, how do you know that I, as a Black man, have checked that box? You don't know. Right? And so I think that that's why disaggregating data has to be really important. And it goes to the question asked in the Q&A. When we talked about employment equity, and I think, you know, now Supreme Court Justice Rosalie Abello had a visionary statement It doesn't go as far as I would have liked, but certainly she recognized that the reason women, persons of color, persons with disabilities, francophones outside of Quebec, and indigenous people were behind, quote unquote, is because of historic systemic barriers that included episodes of violence to subjugate those individuals, those people, those communities. You know, we're seeing it now with the unearthing of bodies in residential spaces. So really what needs to happen is to take that model of employment equity and say, okay, if white artists and white arts organizations are making this amount of money, right, then where are racialized artists by their particular group, Black artists, Asian artists, et cetera, in comparison, and how do we get them there so they can build up their organizations in the same way? I know my organization, we do tons of work. Just look at our website, www.sapamo.org. We do not have significant operating funding. We're hustling all the time. This project, that project, this project, that project, get the money, do the project, write the report, get the money, do the project, write the report. And recently, despite all the work, we're rejected for an operating grant from Canada Council, to the point where many had said, we don't know how that happened, but it happened. So until we're able to really look at what is going to be the path, I like Mary's comment about what is the criteria. How do we change that? How do we get people to understand the differences between different artistic products and outcomes? That the work I do as an artist follows a Black arts tradition, which is non-European, non-Eurocentric, by intent. Is there history? Yes, there is. Is there practice? Yes, there is. But who knows about it? Right? Do the juries know about it? Do the councils know about it? Do they hold that up in the same way they would Bach, Beethoven, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Margaret Atwood? More than likely not. So until we're able to have that map that says, and we were all particularly shocked and dismayed that when Canada Council got a doubling of its funding, which many of us thought would really resolve this issue, it hasn't. To this point now, where Council, for the first time in its strategic plan, is talking about anti-racism. For the first time, despite, as Richard said, being involved in the late 80s and 90s with Council talking about issues of racism. Right? So there has to be the will at the political level. When Mary talks about what the Prime Minister had done, he had his mandate letters that went to all these ministers saying, and in his mandate letter to Heritage, the minister, he talked about diversity. You know, one of the problems we face with that term diversity is it's all inclusive. We are diverse by nature. It's not a social fact. It just is what it is. And so it doesn't talk about gender equality. It doesn't talk about racial equity. It doesn't talk about indigenous equity, et cetera, et cetera. It just is diversity. And so we're lost. What does that mean? So we have to address those issues. And really, it's up to the councils, and I've offered to help them, haven't been taken up on that offer, to iron out a map that would say, here is where we want to be. Here's where we got to be. Our demographics are changing. Right now, it's 1 in every 4 persons in this country is a person of color. That'll be 1 in every 3 in 10 years. Right? So what are we doing about that? Are we going to face cultural apartheid? Or are we going, and I'm using that term advisedly, or are we going to tackle this issue now? New government, minority government, now is the time. People are tired of waiting for the change.
Thank you, Charles. Mary, how do we get the new government?
Yeah, I don't know. Like I said, I was just on Fogo, and Zita Cobb, this extraordinary woman who made a fortune in Ottawa and decided to bring the money home, which has never happened in Newfoundland before. People come to Newfoundland, make their fortune, and then leave. But Zita Cobb made a fortune away and brought it home, and she has put every penny into this inn, which is a kind of high-end inn. But what she's done is and I know that the women's arts, quilting, knitting, all those dismissive things that little old ladies, they dismiss it themselves. They say, "Oh, I'm just sitting watching TV, sure, it's nothing. I might as well be doing that as anything else." Zita Cobb sells these artifacts, these art things, to people from Milwaukee or somewhere, you know, who are spending $1,500 a night to stay in Fogo. She sells them for what they are actually worth if you took the time and the labor and the love and the heart that went into them. Sells them for $2,500, sells them for $5,000, sells socks, you know, home knit socks for $100, you know, things that take Newfoundlanders' breath away, like a pair of socks, $100, oh my God. But she is actually recognizing the worth of these things that have been dismissed, this work, women's work, that has been dismissed for so long and so profoundly that even we women, I'm kind of filling up thinking about it, even we women dismiss our own work as not worth anything, certainly not worth that kind of money, oh my God, you know, but that's just one small thing. And I know but each person, you know, Charles is saying, like Caribbean art and Indigenous art and things that or rather Richard was talking about Caribbean art. So many of us have not been exposed. And so we don't know, you know, so many of us are ignorant in so many ways. Like there is no place, I mean, I'm on the World Wide Web like everybody else. But for so long, we were an island to ourselves and weren't exposed to other things. And I find that as people become as more and more shows go, look at this, I'm just thinking of Picasso when people were so against what he did, and yet they still recognize it as a face. That people go, oh yeah, that, but. And then you see it again and again, and you see it lauded, and you see it raised up, and you see it at the gallery, and you go, you recognize it for what it is, you know, brilliant and beautiful work. And yeah, I think we're each in a way responsible for that. I don't know what I'm going to do myself. But anyway, yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Mary. And Elizabeth, you're muted.
I should have the words "you're muted" tattooed across my forehead. How often have I heard them? And also, I thought that was beautiful what Mary said, first of all, about women's work. And God knows women's fiction has been just so derided over the years as, you know, small and domestic and intimate and unimportant, as opposed to, you know, the great world-shaking works of, you know, Tolstoy or Zola or whoever. So that's an ism we have to deal with, definitely. But also I want to go back to a comment she made earlier, which is, you know, just about the idea of being the change you want to see in the world. And I think we need to talk a little bit about the audience, right? And what the audience's responsibility is. We're consumers of art as well as makers of art. And I walked into Indigo the other day, you know, to get a book. And there was just this giant like display of Sally Rooney's new novel. Like, honest to God, there were like 80 copies of it. And I just thought, you know, fine, Sally Rooney is a talent. She is not to my taste, but, you know, many people enjoy her works and her books. And, but it just made me think, who is being crowded out here by this, you know, whatever she is, 30-year-old Irish woman? You know, we need to have a space for different voices, obviously, but we as consumers, as lovers of art, as consumers of art, need to seek it out, right? We're audience members. We can vote with our dollars. And so, I mean, I don't want to sound too sanctimonious, but like when I go into a bookstore, I do try to buy a book I might buy a comfort book like that, an author I love or a mystery that I want to read. But I then also try to buy a book that by somebody I don't know, maybe that's about a culture I don't know very much about. Maybe it's a book in translation or something. And we can do this with visual arts. We can do it definitely with the performing arts, and also with film and TV. So I don't think we can discount our role as individuals and audience in this.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And I have one request or question for you by one of our viewers. You mentioned two of your favorite writers. One of them was P.D. James. Who is the other one, and can you spell the name?
Oh yeah, Diana Athill, Athill. She died a couple of years ago at the age of 101, I believe. She was writing until the very end. She wrote a book when she was 98. Just an extraordinary, really deft, wonderful, wry memoirist who wrote about her life, in her 80s and 90s, including her sex life, with, great wit and poignancy. And she was just a wonderful writer.
Thank you for that. And also, Mary, you mentioned Mr. Johnson and his book.
Yes.
One of our former board members who is online with us today, Louise Prophet LeBlanc, said that his name was Harold Johnson and the book was called Firewater.
Yes.
So I just thought I'd throw that out there.
We heard about it on Sunday morning. My son and I were driving and we heard him speak, and we had to go out and get the book right away. It will just blow your socks off, really, with what he talks about there. He left the law altogether after the Colton Bushy, the man who killed Colton Bushy was found innocent, and he decided he could no longer be part of any system, whether on the defense side or on the prosecution side, that where this could continue. But he's the most amazing writer.
Thank you for that. And listen, I thank all four of you for joining us today. Unfortunately, we have to wrap it now. As I said last week with Art and Social Change, we didn't even scratch the surface. We scratched the surface of the scratch, I think, today. This is a discussion that's going to continue, and I thank you all for being a part of it. And I wish all four of you well. Richard Fung, Elizabeth Renzetti, Charles Smith, Mary Walsh. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much.
It was really great, really great to be here with you. Okay, bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.